Welcome to Ken ISD Literacy Leaders and Coaches Network Remote Edition. We are excited to bring you our 11th episode of the LLCN Brief. We appreciate those that are now following us on your preferred podcast outlet and excited to share that we now have about 1,800 unique listens to our previous 10 podcast episodes. These listens come from 21 different countries and 37 different states. We appreciate that you are finding value in the information we are making available for you. Thank you for continuing to share your message with those that you know will benefit from listening.
This episode will lean into learning centered around essential number 5 of the Essential Instructional Practices in Early Literacy, K3, explicit instruction in letter sound relationships. My name is Sarah Shoemaker, and I'm an early literacy coach at Kent Intermediate School District.
And I'm Mark Raffler. I'm an educational consultant in English, Language Arts, and Social Studies, also at Kent Intermediate School District. As always, with the release of the recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP data, there has been a large amount of talk happening in Michigan and across the country in relation to the teaching of reading. In these conversations, you have heard about the simple view of reading, the active view of reading, the science of reading, so many ideas around reading. With all of this information available, it can be confusing where the focus should be. One of the best ways to combat that is to engage in professional learning on the teaching of reading. We will explore the essentials of how kids learn to read and principles of high quality foundational skills instruction in this episode of our podcast.
Today, our guest, Dr. Julia Lindsey, joins us for an in depth exploration of this topic based on her book, Reading Above the Fray: Reliable Research Based Routines for Developing Decoding Skills.
We are honored to have Dr. Julia Lindsey joining us today. Julia is a foundational literacy expert and consultant. She is the author of the newly released book, Reading Above the Fray: Research Based Routines for Developing Decoding Skills. From training teachers and district leaders to developing and evaluating curriculum to engaging in research, Julia partners with countless others to help close the research to practice gap in reading. Julia holds a BS in psychology from Davidson College, a MAT from Relay Graduate School of Education, and a PhD in educational studies, specializing in literacy, language, and culture from the University of Michigan. She is a proud former elementary school teacher. Thanks for joining us today, Julia.
Happy to be here with you.
Dr. Lindsey, educators are hearing about various views and models of reading. In the first chapter of your book, Reading Above the Fray, you reference and visually depict 3 of these views: the simple view of reading, the reading rope, and the active view of reading. What is important for educators to be aware of here?
Yes, those 3 views are really prominent right now, and people talk about them a lot. And there's actually about 20 years between each of those views. So that's the first thing to know, is that we start with the simple view from the 80s, and then the rope is in about 2000, and the active view is just very recently in the last couple of years here. So the first thing to know is that they're building on each other over decades of research. The second thing to know is that we don't need to be intimidated by them or intimidated by the complexity that some of these models suggest. So they're really meant to be used theoretically so that we can think about what are the components that go into reading. They don't necessarily mean to suggest, oh, you need to teach this exact thing during a specific time of day. You need to have a time of day called this every single aspect that you see on one of those models. What they're really trying to do is to say, what do we know from research is going into that reading process for any individual? At the end of the day, all 3 of them really do boil down to components that we need for word recognition and components that we need for language comprehension. And now the active view, which Nell Duke, who is, also at the University of Michigan, one of the authors of that, does a little bit more work to try to notice some of the components that are bridging between word recognition and comprehension, and to highlight Additionally, in ways that are new and updated, a little bit more about the necessity of cultural and background knowledge in reading. At the end of the day, all three boil down to the same two major components, and some of them just show more complexity than others. But they're actually really, in my opinion, in conversation with one another, and none of those models means that any of the other ones are wrong, just that they're showing us a little bit of a different look at what reading is.
Wow. Thank you for that succinct view of these three models that are sometimes misunderstood or taken at a surface level or sometimes even confused. I love the way that you laid out 20 years between each model and they're building upon each other with decades of research. That really stuck with me and allowed me to see the similarities and the differences at the same time when you mentioned that the active view takes into maybe more consideration that picture of the whole child that brings in the cultural and background knowledge as well.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And again, research is always growing, always changing. We're always learning new things. That's the beauty of science. So I'm excited to know what the next model of reading will look like and what complexities we'll add. But I feel pretty confident that at the end of the day, we'll still see those major components of what leads to word recognition and what leads to language comprehension represented.
I really appreciate, Julia, you bringing up do not be intimidated and boiling it down to the components that we all need. Building off of that further, in your book, you talk about foundational skills. So, this is another one we're not used to, we're intimidated by. And you focus on the importance of decoding. As kids are learning to decode, what are the essential elements?
I love this question. I mean, again, I agree. It's we're about boiling things down to what are we really essentially talking about here. So I'll start by saying that the reason why I focus so much on decoding is because a lot of times when we talk about foundational skills, what we really are saying is what skills am I teaching children to recognize words and to become automatic word recognizers? And actually, the route to doing that is by teaching kids how to decode words and giving them the opportunity to do so. Instead of saying, okay, let's talk about phonics, I really wanted to talk about decoding so that we could foreground that. And because I believe that if we can teach decoding on purpose instead of incidentally, we're going to ensure that children are more likely to become those automatic, accurate word readers. So, if we think about foundational skills that way, and we think about what are the elements that are going to go into teaching a child to decode, we can focus in on things like print concepts. So you do have to know what is a book in order to deal with a book. You got to know what a word is. You got to know where to start reading if you're going to read anything. Phonemic awareness. So, in particular, knowing how to isolate a sound in a word, knowing how to blend sounds together and segment sounds so that you can hear one at a time. And those skills are utterly essential for being able to decode and read a word or encode and spell a word. And then, of course, sound spelling relationships. So, knowing, okay, when I see EE in a word, it probably makes the long E sound. And then, of course, vocabulary and oral language development. We have to have knowledge of the words and know what they mean in order to do anything about them. So, even though that might not be as critical in the exact moment of trying to figure out what that word is, in that case, we should really be relying on the letter sound relationships. We do need to know what it means at the end of the day. So, we should never discount meaning. But those elements together are what allow us to start practicing and learning how to decode words and then decoding more and more and more. And then when we add some more components, we're able to give kids access to multisyllabic word decoding, which I call chunking. And so those components are really about how do we teach kids to grapple with really big words? Here you are sitting in front of a 10-letter word. What are you even supposed to do with it? Well, the easiest way to deal with those words is to break them into chunks that we can then use just all of our other knowledge, our sound spelling knowledge and our phonemic awareness to read each chunk and then put them back together. So the two best ways to break words into chunks are with morphemes, so like prefixes and suffixes and root words, or with syllable types. And some are better than others because there's some syllable types that aren't as stable as we would like. So when we add all of those components together, and at the end of the day, it's really not that many. I think it's about 5 components plus vocabulary, then we're able to teach kids how to decode single syllable words and multisyllabic words. And we can really focus our instruction on what we have as a goal in mind and our purpose around that actual act of decoding. And of course, its sister encoding or spelling, rather than kind of getting marred down by all of these terms we hear floating around and all of the other things that sometimes people call foundational skills.
Yeah, I like how you started with teach on purpose. And then from there, where that might seem still overwhelming, you did simplify it and you summarized that at the end, pointing out just the 5 or so elements to consider. And then again, one thing I think that sometimes gets away, and I found myself guilty of this even when I was in the classroom, is matching up the decoding with the encoding. I know that's a part that was very powerful for me as I went through my classroom experience and building up on that. And so for you to make it seem so simple and to teach on purpose and really speak to that and then list them out to have there, because those are things I believe that we have at our fingertips that sometimes seem too difficult to work through, but you made it seem very simple in how they all fit together.
Well, thank you. I do think that actually a lot of us are doing a lot of these things in our classroom, but we might not be doing them as systematically or as explicitly as we could. And if we just kind of turn the dial on exactly how we're using these skills in our classroom and what we're telling kids that they can do with these skills and how to practice them in books, then we can really make a big difference.
Julia, considering the decoding and the elements you just described as foundational skills, this can sometimes be a large amount of information to process and move forward with. What is a good starting point for educators in our audience that might be ready to make changes in their instruction?
That is an excellent question. And one of the reasons why in the book and in a lot of talks I do, I really try to focus on small swaps that we can accomplish in our classroom. And I try even to think about what are some swaps that you can try out tomorrow without needing to buy a new curriculum or find new resources, but that you could probably do with what you already have in your classroom and you could just try out for 5 or 10 minutes and see how it goes. So, the first place that I suggest that everybody should start is with phonemic awareness. And the reason for that is twofold. The first reason is because, for whatever reason, most of the time our phonics curriculum have not emphasized it enough. Unless you have a brand new phonics curriculum, and by brand new, I mean not new to you, I mean new to the world, something that was created in the last year or two, it's unlikely that it's emphasizing phonemic awareness enough. And the second reason is because phonemic awareness can give us a massive bang for our buck. We know from research that having a deficit in phonemic awareness is one of the biggest reasons why kids have reading difficulties in early childhood, but also later in life. We also know that adding in a little bit of practice with this can really change children's reading outcomes. So, if you are getting ready to teach phonics tomorrow or a small group lesson in literacy, I would suggest adding in 5 minutes focused on phonemic awareness. And that can look like a couple different ways. I'll give 2 suggestions. If you're in kindergarten, do a little bit of practice isolating the initial sound in words that is connected to one of the letters that you're currently teaching. If you're teaching, for example, the letter S, have kids listen for the S sound at the beginning of some words. And you can do this orally as a class with kids just raising their hands, or they can stretch their hands out like they're holding an accordion and listen for that sound. Or you can use Alconin boxes in front of each kid. So that's if you look it up online, it's those rectangles with 3 different boxes inside, and they can point their finger across it, or you can just show one on the board and do it together. And after you listen for that initial sound, since it's a letter you've already taught, then ask children, what letter spells that sound? And have either you writing it on the board or all of them practicing handwriting that letter in the first box on their Alconin boxes. And in that way, we're directly connecting that phonemic awareness practice, that listening and practicing saying sounds to actual letters that's going to strengthen children's outcomes in reading and spelling. If you're in first grade or second grade, or if you're in a later grade and you have children who are still working on the early stages of decoding, then do a little practice with blending and segmenting. So we know from several decades of research on phonemic awareness that the most important aspects of phonemic awareness for readers are blending and segmenting sounds. And so when we're thinking about using time for phonemic awareness, we should really try to think about making the most time dedicated to blending and segmenting across grade levels. An amount of time in total, 5 to 10 minutes a day maximum. And again, you should try to connect letters in sometimes, at least at the end of your phonemic awareness practice. So if you're going to do some blending and segmenting, it can be with any number of sounds in a word, but say you're working on consonant blends and you want to read a word like the first word that comes to mind is blood for some reason. So I guess it has a good consonant blend there at the beginning, but you can say things like, I'm going to say sounds, and then you tell me what word it is. B-l-u-d. Okay, now let's put it together, say the whole word. If children are having challenges with that, try to focus on using continuous sounds. So things like saying van instead, where you stretch through all the sounds together and you don't break the sound stream like I just did in the example with blood. And that will help kids get into the word a little faster because they aren't distracted by that schwa sound that we tend to add to the end of stop sounds. So practicing things like that, again, it doesn't have to be a huge amount of time, but really honing in on that oral only practice. And then when appropriate, because it's the same things that you're studying in phonics, go ahead and have kids spell it out or see the words represented on with letters in some way so that you're making that direct connection to this is not just this like weird practice that we're doing where we're closing our eyes and we're listening for sounds. This is actually something that we're doing in the service of becoming readers and writers.
Thank you for those small swaps that we can put in tomorrow. I think previously in education, we tried to separate phonics and phonemic awareness quite a bit and create a distinction that they were two different things. And obviously, we didn't give enough time to the phonemic awareness part. And now, hearing you talk about linking that to the letters, linking it back to the reading, so important to make that connection for kiddos. And you saying, like, if you don't have a phonemic awareness curriculum that's been put into the world in the past year or two, it's probably outdated. Can you give us just a little bit more information on why you're saying that?
Yes, so this is mostly based on my personal experience with looking at different curricula and using different curricula with different context. I just find that most of the time when I'm looking at a phonics curriculum or I'm supporting a school, I notice that there's just a gap in terms of how systematic it is in phonemic awareness. And if you have a phonemic awareness curriculum, oftentimes those historically have focused a lot on rhyming. And rhyming is cool and it's fun, but it is not nearly as beneficial for reading and writing as phonemes are. So, rhyming is really about larger parts of a word than just the single sounds. But we know that for reading and writing, we actually need to be paying a ton of attention to the individual sounds. So, therefore, our practice in oral only activities like phonemic awareness should be about the single sounds. And there is actually research that suggests that you can teach children about phonemic awareness without necessarily having to go too deep into rhyming, even in preschool. So we don't necessarily need to worry and spend tons and tons of time on rhyming in terms of impacting reading. We might still do rhyming activities, but the bang for our buck in terms of phonemic awareness activities is those focusing on individual sounds, blending and segmenting. Generally, when I see curriculum in this space, a lot of the phonics curriculum just simply are not as systematic enough and don't have enough practice, specifically in phonemic awareness. The phonemic awareness programs tend to just focus a lot more on rhyming than what we really need.
Thank you for that clarification.
Many times the focus of this work is on the early grades of elementary. How is this work applicable in upper elementary?
I know this question is on a lot of folks' minds, especially as we notice how many children might not be super proficient at word recognition in the upper grades, either due to COVID disrupting life or any other kind of reason that a child might need extra support. So there's a few things to know. The first is that the components of word reading don't change based on your age. So if you need to know that CH spells ch, you need to know that if you're 30 and you're learning to read, if you're 80 if you're learning to read, or if you're 5 and you're learning to read. So those basic components are not person dependent. Those are things that are dependent on our language and the written forms that we have themselves. So we still need kids to experience that explicit and systematic instruction in those core components. The second thing to know is that we know from research, pretty much without a shadow of a doubt, that one of the big differences with older children is that we need to be even more attentive to meaning. So, when we look at interventions that are supporting children in learning how to decode in the later grades, the most successful ones focus also quite a bit on what do words mean and in making sure that children can really do something with the words that they're learning. This not only makes it a little bit more developmentally appropriate, but it also might support if there's any comprehension or vocabulary needs that that child has. And it is also likely that most of the words that those kids are reading are going to be multisyllabic, where we need to lean into meaning a lot anyhow. So, when we're thinking about supporting older learners, we want to think about multiple components of reading being supported all at once. So thinking, how can I support a child in learning to decode and learning the meaning of this word and maybe reading it in context? And can I support them in their fluency in some ways? That might sound sort of overwhelming, but there's a lot of programs that actually already do this. And you can think about it as it might be as simple as teach the letter sound pattern, read it in some words in isolation that are single syllable, practice reading it maybe in some multisyllabic words that are, if you really want to get fancy, that are connected to some science topic that we're doing later in the day, and that's going to give this child a little bit of an insight and a preview of later content so that they're more prepared. And then we're going to read in a book where we're seeing this a lot, and then we're going to do some repeated reading of a passage to practice our fluency. So really thinking about more holistic support of that process is really important when we're thinking about the older learner to support their success and also to support their motivation and engagement, because they do have different needs because they're a different age, and things that are exciting to a 5-year-old are not going to be the same for a 10-year-old. Remember that all the components are still the same, but we might need to think about how we're wrapping them up a little bit differently. And then the last point I'll make about older learners is that we know that they might have to unlearn some things. And they also might have gaps that are unanticipated. So make sure to do a really careful assessment of their knowledge and to build off of that knowledge rather than starting everybody at the same starting point like we might do in kindergarten. Because again, we want to support their success and their motivation simultaneously and make sure that we're really giving kids exactly what they need to accelerate their access back into the grade level curriculum rather than having them need to lag behind for years and years if they start at day 1 of kindergarten, but they're a 4th grader.
Thank you for starting off with that acknowledgement of which really struck me was it being dependent on the language, not on the person. I think that's a good way to help kind of shift that view that we might have about what responsibilities are and what that looks like. And I appreciate focusing on the language. And again, you break it down and make it seem very simple to the fact that the approach is similar, but there's a process to it that they would follow in order to help kids be successful, or older learners, as used the term, to be successful. And I was actually formulating a follow-up question around how does motivation play a role, and you answered it perfectly. And I really appreciated the idea of things of interest are different based on age, but then also you talked about starting where they need to start versus starting from square one. And both of those aspects really factor into motivation, helping it make motivation even more clear for me in this moment.
What resources would you recommend as our listeners look to learn more about reliable research based routines?
Well, I'll start with the obvious one, which is that I welcome you to look into my book. It's called Reading Above the Fray. and it's available everywhere books are sold, so far as I'm aware. Got a lot of routines in it for developing decoding skills that hopefully can help you in your classroom. If you are looking specifically for decodable texts, I will again direct you to a resource of mine. It's called beyonddecodables.com. And we have about 75 content rich decodable texts, primarily for the K through 2 children, but could be read by anybody who's at those stages between learning to read CVC words and reading early multisyllabic words. Other places that I would suggest you look, and I do try to think about free resources, would be the UFLI Resource Hub. They have a new curriculum that is available for purchase, but if you don't want to buy that, they have a lot of resources for free on their website that are researcher created and teacher tested. And they just have so many cool things on there. I'm in no way affiliated with them, but I do think they're very cool and very helpful. One of the things that they have that I think is particularly helpful is that they have their scope and sequence laid out against about 10 publishers' decodable texts. And then you can see which books from those publishers match up with the UFLI scope and sequence. The cool thing, though, is that anyone could actually look at that and see, well, what does my scope and sequence match up with? Because they've laid it out so clearly. So you don't have to be using their curriculum to use that resource and to use it as a way to find, is there a need in my district for decodable text? Do we have a budget to buy from one of these publishers? That's a place to start your search so that you maybe get a good idea of which one might match your scope and sequence. So those are some of the places I would urge people to start. And then, it really depends on what more you're looking for. But I also like the edutopia.org blog. That's often by researchers, and they get some really cool, interesting information, often about recent research findings and how to apply them in your classroom. And it's a reliable source of information. So that's another one I would add if people are into reading blog posts.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsey, for that. I know you emphasize about halfway through you're into free, so it's accessible to more people. And that's what we appreciate about your Beyond the Decodables.com, that was a partnership you did with a school district, correct?
Yes, it is.
And that your emphasis there was that the work would be accessible to others. Recently just learned about the UFLI. Some people call that UFly. I don't know if that's really what it. I know that you can purchase the teacher manual there for under $100. I don't know how far that goes into their curriculum, but really accessible resources for educators in classroom to start to take the next step in these research-based routines. And then going back to your book, Reading Above the Fray, when Mark and I were reading that, we had dialogue about how easy it was to read a section and take that information and put it into practice in a classroom, that it was just laid out clearly. There were actionable items. It was easily understood. So thank you for sharing these resources with us today.
We've asked some questions and appreciate all the expertise that you have offered. As we conclude this interview, what have we not asked that is important to highlight here?
I think you did ask some pretty great questions, but I'll just highlight two other things. The first thing that I'll say goes back a little bit to our older learners, but also to all learners. And that's that I think that sometimes when we think about foundational skills instruction, we think about it in this separate arena away from reading instruction and writing instruction, away from content, away from any aspects of our classroom that we're trying to be culturally responsive in, and sometimes even away from joy. And one of the things that I hope everybody can start thinking about differently is how joyful and, yes, exciting foundational skills instruction can be, and how much more powerful it can be if we connect it into all of these other things that we're doing in our classroom. So that might mean that you strive to connect children's spelling during a science lesson to a concept that they learned in phonics. That might mean that you do your very best to find decodable texts that are relevant to the children's backgrounds that you have in your classroom. That might mean that you rethink how you're teaching reading in small group to make sure that you're really foregrounding foundational skills that are going to help children with word recognition. It might mean that you think about, what does joy really look like when kids are learning these basics of reading for children versus what does joy feel like for me as a teacher? And can I find joy in the moments that kids successfully decode a word instead of in things like feeling very colorful or fun, but in feeling that joy in academic success? So I think that that's the first thing that I'll say, is just thinking about how we're building readers and writers with these skills and all of the times that they could be reading or writing, and how to bring that in to the same experience and to bring that joy in. The second thing I'll say is that I know that everything feels crazy right now if you are someone who's really attentive towards social media or towards press and news about reading. And I think that we should all just give ourselves the grace to take some deep breaths and to think carefully about how we want to change things in our classroom or in our schools, and to really try to ground ourselves in continuing to do our very best for children and not necessarily diving too fast into any one given change, but giving ourselves the grace to learn and to try new things and to adjust as we need to, and to lean on our colleagues and others as we learn new things. And I think that that is going to end up meaning that we are able to better educate the kids in our classrooms instead of paying too much attention to some of the really hyped up information out there that might just be a bit much. I mean, it's exhausting to be a teacher. It's the hardest job in the world. Try not to let it get to you, I guess, is the point that I'm saying. You don't have to let it all get to you, and you can still become more precise at teaching word recognition.
I appreciate those encouraging words, and I like how you use that term of joy. As you said, it's hard to find joy possibly at times with all of the information coming, again, especially if we're following those different media outlets. But then you also talk about considering older learners, all learners, and then making those connections at all the times that we're working with text. I think with Common Core, we really flipped this definition of text on its head. Not that it wasn't always there, it just made us really rethink what really is text. And you draw attention to that by saying, fill it, make it work throughout the aspects of your day in your science and your social studies at different times as you're working. And then in the end, you said something that's all too familiar to what we share, and you use different words, which were great, but we always talk a lot of here in Kent County about go slow to go fast. And you really acknowledge that. And it certainly is a time when that is more important maybe than ever. So thanks for those words of encouragement to the teachers that we're supporting and providing this information to.
Thanks so much for having me on and for chatting with me today. I hope that you can all have some happy time reading.
Thanks, Dr. Lindsey. Thank you for joining us for this LLCN brief podcast today. We appreciate our guest, Dr. Julia Lindsey. Thank you for sharing your insight into research-based routines for developing decoding skills. If you're looking to access the resources from today's podcast episode, please visit our electronic document, LLCN 2022-2023 resources at bit.ly/LLCN resources 2223. Again, bit.ly/capital L, capital L, capital C, capital N, lowercase resources 2223.
We look forward to connecting with you again in the near future. Also, we're looking for your suggestions on topics as well as questions you may have related to literacy. Please take the time to let us know what you want to learn more about through our Google form. You can access this Google form at bit.ly/LLCN topics. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/capital L, capital L, capital C, capital N, all lowercase topics. Thank you for listening today.